was hit by this suicide truck bomb. There was a Marine who was next to me, and we grabbed each other, and we made our way outside of the eastern side of the barracks. And as soon as we got outside, I fell down to my hands and knees. And because of the chlorine, my eyes were burning, my nose was burning, my throat was burning. I was down on my hands and knees, and I was just kind of coughing, choking, spitting. And I looked down then, and I saw that I had blood all over my uniform. So I started to pat myself down to check for an injury. I didn't feel like I was injured, but one of the things that we're trained to know, and that all of you know, is that sometimes a surge of adrenaline can actually mask the pain of an injury. And so I started to pat myself down again, and then finally, I pulled my hands away, and I realized it's not my blood. It was the blood of my friend Joel, who had been standing about this close to me. And this was, for me, this was a really hard moment as a leader on the front lines. As a leader on the front lines, you always have two missions. One mission is the mission that's been handed down to you. And the other unspoken mission that you have every single day is that you are going to find a way to bring everybody who's on your team back home to their families. And for me, when this happened, I started to ask myself some tough questions. And I started to think, maybe there was something that we could have done differently on the front lines. Maybe we could have checked our communications one last time. Maybe we should have had out more earthen barriers. Maybe we should have had out more barbed wire. And you start to ask yourself these tough questions about what you can do differently on the front lines. And in the military, when we think about the front lines, we usually think about the front lines as the place where you come in contact with the enemy. The front line is a place where you come right in contact with the enemy. But one of the things that I've recognized, especially doing the work that I do today with returning veterans who've come home, is that everyone has a front line in their life. Everybody has a place where they encounter pain, where they encounter hardship, where they encounter fear, where they encounter difficulty. And we're working today with hundreds of veterans who've come home and who are facing a new front line on their life here today. Phil Sturgeon, who you saw in the Tom Brokaw video, he was in the passenger seat in a truck in a convoy when a rocket-propelled grenade came in, hit Phil, and actually blew him out onto the street. Today, Phil Sturgeon has severe injuries to the entire right side of his body. He has traumatic brain injuries, overcoming post-traumatic stress. And I know that Phil Sturgeon is facing a new front line here at home. One of the things that I'd ask all of you to do right now is just reflect for a moment on your own front line. You can certainly think about your front line as a physician, you can think about your front line as a DO, but also think about your service on the front line as a leader. Think about the fact that people are looking to you and people are caring, that you are caring for people in a leadership situation on the front lines. And what I want to do is share with you a lesson or an analogy that we use both in the SEAL teams and at the Mission Continues about how we talk about navigating those front lines successfully. And the analogy that we make is to the use of a compass. So before I joined the military, I'd never actually used a compass before, but I learned pretty quickly that if I took a compass and I pointed it in a particular direction, I could walk all day. And I might walk over mountains, I could walk through a forest, I could walk through a desert. And what would happen is, at the end of the day, I'd end up in one very particular place. What I also learned was, if at the beginning of my journey I made a decision that I was going to make a change of course, and I might make a change of course of just 1 or 2 degrees, but I decided I was going to make a change of course, and I started to walk that new path. And again, I could walk it over mountains, I could walk it through a forest, I could walk it through a desert. What would happen is, at the end of the day, I'd end up in a completely different place. And today, we're working with men and women who sometimes, some of them have lost their eyesight, they might have lost their hearing, they might have been severely burned, they might have lost limbs. And as they come home, we know that oftentimes their military career has come to an end. And if they're in the reserves or they're in the National Guard, sometimes their civilian careers come to an end. And the leadership challenge that I and my team put in front of them is to make a change of course of a couple of degrees and to walk a new path here at home until every single one of them is able to come home and to find a way to again live a purposeful life as a citizen leader again here at home. That's the challenge that we've put in front of them. Now, one of the first things that that all of you will notice about this analogy is the very first thing that our veterans notice, which is that this is a really easy thing to say and an incredibly difficult thing to do. Again, you think about your own leadership, you think about your own service, you think about touching and healing patients every day on the front line, and you think about what it might take to use an opportunity like this where you've stepped out of your normal everyday routine, and you think about what it might take to make a change of course of just a couple of degrees, and then to walk that new path over time until you've gotten to a place where you've actually changed who you are as a leader and you've changed the way that you can be of service to the people around you, and you recognize how hard that actually is to do. I've been very fortunate in what I've learned from Navy SEALs. I've been very fortunate in what I've learned from working with the hundreds of men and women who I work with who've come home from places like Iraq and Afghanistan to see how people actually can make these kinds of changes of course and bring about these sorts of transformation in their own leadership and in their own service on the front lines. And I want to share that with you today. Now, the first time that I had any idea that I might want to be a warrior, I was 19 years old. As John mentioned, I grew up in Missouri, and before I was 19, I had never been outside of the country before. I'd never been very far outside of Missouri. When I was 19, I was overseas for the very first time. I had an idea that I might want to be a warrior, so what I did in my 19-year-old wisdom was I signed up for a Kung Fu class. And I signed up for a class with this guy. He's on the left-hand side of your screen. He's a monk who'd been trained at the Shaolin Temple in China. And he was considered to be one of the hardest, toughest Kung Fu instructors in China. Now what happened was, I studied with him for about 4 or 5 weeks, and then on the day of the first test, all of the students were made to come out and to line up and to stand like this. You had to stand like this and to balance 4 bricks on top of their head. Now I thought that was the test. What you can see is he had a very different idea of what the test was going to be. And what he would do is he'd bring the sledgehammer down and actually smash the bricks over all the students' heads. Now, I think we can all agree that this is a very demanding teacher. Right? And he was an incredibly demanding teacher. One of the reasons why I share that with you is because one of the things that we do in the work that we do today with returning veterans is we ask them to remember the first day that they made a decision that they were going to make a change of course in their own lives, and they decided that they wanted to be a warrior, that they wanted to be a citizen soldier. And what we ask them to remember that first day when they walked into boot camp, that first day when they walked into the Naval Academy or the Coast Guard Academy, the Air Force Academy, or West Point. What we ask them to remember is that when they made a decision that they were going to make a change of course in their own life, and they're going to walk this new path, we ask them to remember that in that very first day, they encountered pain. What we ask them to remember is that in those very first days, they had to deal with fear. What we ask them to remember is that in those first days and weeks that they suffered. We also ask them to remember is that by working through that pain, they became wiser. That by repeatedly confronting their fear, they became more courageous. And that by working through suffering, they actually became stronger. And what we remind them of is that then with that wisdom, and with that courage, and with that strength, they had all found a way to change who they were, and to change the way they could be of service to the people around them. We remind them of this because we know that if they're going to set out on this new course, that they're also going to have to deal here with new fears, and new pain, and new suffering. But we also remind them that it's absolutely possible for them to make this kind of transformation happen in their own leadership and in their own service. Now, when I ultimately made it into the United States military, I went to BUDS. BUDS stands for Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. It's the basic Navy SEAL training. It takes place just across the bay here in Coronado, California. I was in BUDS class 237. As many of you know, BUDS has a reputation for being some of the hardest military training in the world. In BUDS class 237, we started with over 220 people in the original class, and by the time we graduated, we were down to 21. And what happens over the course of the training is that every single day, they hit you with a new test or a new challenge. So one of the first tests that you have in your very first week is that you have to walk up to the edge of the pool, you jump in, you do a front flip underwater, and then you swim 50 meters underwater. It's one of the very first tests.